Let us be aware that while they preach the supremacy of the state, declare its omnipotence over individual man, and predict its eventual domination of all peoples on the earth, they are the focus of evil in the modern world.
During the last half of the 20th century, the stagnant relations of the United States and the Soviet Union prevented agreements to stimulate peace. But in the 1980s, Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev overcame this conflict through their 4 summit meetings following the methods of personal diplomacy and their common goal for compromise. Between their summit in Reykjavik to their summit in Washington, D.C., the conflict between the nations was transformed into the completion of a vital arms agreement, exemplifying their compromise through their willingness to concede in order to rescue negotiations. Reagan and Gorbachev's influence has helped modern diplomats navigate the threats of nuclear holocaust in the hope of denuclearization. Reagan and Gorbachev's 4 summits led to the ultimate end of the Cold War and set a precedent for future compromises between the U.S. and Russia, spawning a global era of nuclear reduction. In the late 20th century, the Cold War was an indirect battle between the United States and the Soviet Union, where both sides tried to undermine the ideological system of the other country by proving their dominance in various arenas. But in late 60s and 70s, leaders like Richard Nixon and Leonid Brezhnev eased tensions and established close relations in an era called détente. During détente, many agreements were developed, including the SALT treaties, limiting nuclear proliferation, and the ABM Treaty, limiting defensive systems to maintain the safeguard of mutually assured destruction. However, both sides kept large nuclear arsenals because of the distrust still prevalent. The previous agreements did not solve the Cold War mentality of nuclearization and could not nurture cooperation. The Soviet Union also continued to assist numerous communist revolutions around the world, provoking further division. When they invaded Afghanistan in 1979, Jimmy Carter withdrew the SALT II treaty from Senate ratification, ending the détente period and resuming tension. As the Cold War continued, both sides needed to resolve the conflict, so in 1980, Ronald Reagan became the President of the United States. His election was advantageous because, in contrast to leaders like Nixon and Carter, he posed a tough front against the Soviets, ensuring that the U.S. would not be taken advantage of again.
Well, so far, détente's been a one-way street, and the Soviet Union is used to pursue its own aims. I don't have to think of an answer as to what I think their intentions are. They have repeated it.
He even called the Soviet Union an evil empire due to its supposed corruption and Leonid Brezhnev's drainage of public funds for a dramatic increase of Soviet military spending during the 70s.
The reason that Reagan succeeded is that he had a clear idea of what he wanted to do, and he had the courage and the intelligence to engage in this winning dual strategy.
Reagan recognized that the Soviets couldn't go on this way much longer, making compromise beneficial for them soon. He took advantage of this by pursuing agreements favorable for the U.S. and the world. He replaced the term arms limitation with arms reduction in the hopes of eradicating all nuclear weapons.
Basically, Reagan wanted to rebuild the U.S. military and negotiate new arms deals with the Soviet Union.
He also understood that the U.S. could only have a negotiating power in meetings with the Soviets if it built its military up to a similar status, so he deployed Pershing II missiles in Europe to counter the Soviet missiles aimed at NATO capitals. However, Leonid Brezhnev was unwilling to take as big of steps in the direction of nuclear reduction. Also, Brezhnev's untimely death brought a halt to discussion with the Soviets. Additionally, the next 2 general secretaries, Yuri Andropov and Konstantin Chernenko, died a little over a year after assuming power in 1984 and 1985 respectively. If Reagan wished to meet with the Soviet leader soon, they would need to stand out from the Soviet traditional communism and share his goal for peace between the countries. On March 11, 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became the General Secretary of the Soviet Union. When he came to power, he made it his goal to reform the Soviet government and the corruption in the Politburo bureaucracy, such as the lengthy terms for government officials and the clandestine workings of the KGB that hindered his ability to govern. He did this through his 2 principles of glasnost, or government transparency, and perestroika, economic freedom and labor efficiency. His role as a reformer in the Soviet Union also extended to the realm of foreign affairs, improving his ability to reach agreements. He resumed formal communication with the U.S., in which he and Reagan were able to meet.
Gorbachev was willing to negotiate with Reagan. So you had these two leaders who understood the importance of personal diplomacy.
In October 1986, the two leaders met for a summit meeting in Reykjavik, Iceland to discuss nuclear weapons issues such as Intermediate Nuclear Forces, INF, Strategic Arms Reduction, START, and the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, Reagan's Satellite Anti-Ballistic Missile Defense Proposition. This was a follow-up to their first meeting in Geneva, in which they outlined their issues in nuclear arms, regional proxy conflicts like in Afghanistan, human rights issues, and bilateral cultural exchanges. In the meeting, they were unable to accomplish any tangible agreements. Their use of personal diplomacy for private communication allowed their talks to be efficient and made compromise more guaranteed while enhancing their discussion. Throughout the Reykjavik meeting, it seemed like it would be a success, at one point with the prospect of eliminating nuclear weapons entirely being on the table. Ultimately, though, it came down to both sides' unwillingness to make a concession on SDI in order to achieve this historic agreement, and they both left the meeting disappointed. Gorbachev refused to accept it because it infringed on the ABM Treaty, linking it to arms reduction, and Reagan was compelled to install the system for the protection of his people. The main reason for their persisting conflict stemmed from their stubbornness and inability to make concessions to maintain communication. They kept the doctrines of their predecessors, preventing peaceful interaction. This tragic example of conflict, because of its effect on the modern world, resulted from the failure to reach an unprecedented compromise. The conflict between the two nations continued until they were able to materialize an agreement. After Reykjavik, Gorbachev conceded his linkage on INF and SDI because of Reagan's moral adherence to it. He also was pressured into agreements due to the Soviet financial state from the arms race, although Reagan was more inclined to concede. This proves that Reagan was very stubborn in negotiations and resisted giving up ground.
It was really the understanding that Gorbachev had that they simply were at such a disadvantage without the defensive capability that the U.S. was about to achieve.
In December 1987, the two leaders concluded the INF Treaty in a summit in Washington, D.C., leading to the elimination of an entire class of nuclear missiles with a range between 500 and 5,500 kilometers, removing the nuclear threat from Europe. This meeting represents the effect of their personal diplomacy and resulted directly from the concessions made by Gorbachev. It shows the extent of what might be accomplished through compromise and its ability to erase the warmongering ideologies of the earlier Cold War era. The summit was regarded as their most important meeting and the epitome of their overall compromise due to its production of one of the most important arms agreements in history. In May 1988, Ronald Reagan met Mikhail Gorbachev in Moscow for the last of their summits. They began to set the framework for the START Treaty and discuss various issues pertaining to human rights problems in each country. The most memorable part of the trip was Reagan and Gorbachev's walk through the Red Square, where Reagan could personally communicate with the citizens of what he had previously called an evil empire. It assisted in the reinstallation of private communication and trust between the two nations. Throughout their summits, Reagan and Gorbachev created a simple means of communication through the precedent set of personal diplomacy. They paved the way for future agreements like the START Treaty signed by George H.W. Bush and Gorbachev in 1991 and other START agreements concluded by Clinton, George W. Bush, and Obama. Their work shaped an end to the Cold War and the reforms they made in both their systems and through the concessions they made for compromise. Reagan's unwillingness to concede in discussions partially led to Gorbachev's decline in power because he forced Gorbachev into a position where he was perceived as weak in his country. This resulted in the dissolution of the Soviet Union and Gorbachev's removal from power because of the opposition to reform within his own government. Although tensions were put at ease since the 90s, a return to hostility between the US and Russia has formed due to the personal beliefs of Vladimir Putin and the threat that he has posed to the country's peaceful bond, proving that success in diplomacy often relies on a leader's personality to strengthen it.
What you have now is in what is now Russia, a reversion to the tactics and to the secrecy, and it is a police state.
Nevertheless, Reagan and Gorbachev's four summits and the agreements that they produced revolutionized foreign diplomacy and their ability to avoid conflict on the eve of nuclear holocaust. Reagan and Gorbachev used their personalities and political backgrounds to build their agreements and conceded when negotiations reached a stalemate to overcome a conflict. They mended a glowing divide between the two nations and reduced tension in Europe with their INF Treaty built through their discussions. Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev formed not only an alliance, but a profound friendship that led to the end of the Cold War and Paranoia, while pushing for a promotion of peace.